It was supposed to be just another panel on international leadership. A Thursday night segment, live on CNN, titled, Global Strongmen or Strategic Leaders? Adam Schiff sat across from Ibrahim Traoré, legs crossed, face calm, oozing that practiced political confidence. The moderator had barely finished the question about African sovereignty when Schiff leaned forward with a smirk. "Let's be honest," Schiff said. "The idea that someone like Mr. Traoré is shaping global policy is adorable." The panel laughed. Schiff smiled wider. "Sorry," he added with theatrical sarcasm, "but it's hard to take advice from a man whose country doesn't even have a Starbucks." The studio audience chuckled. But Traoré didn't. He turned his head slowly. No smile. No blink. Then he picked up his glass of water, took a slow sip, and placed it back down. "Are you done?" he asked calmly. Schiff opened his mouth to reply, but Traoré leaned forward before he could. "You mock the absence of a coffee chain. I count the absence of drone strikes. Perhaps one of us has more to learn." The laughter died instantly. Even the host froze. What followed was a long, uneasy silence. The segment wrapped early. But the internet? It exploded. Clips of the exchange went viral. Hashtag Traoré claps back. Hashtag Starbucks can't he fix this. Hashtag mocked then sued. Because the next morning, Ibrahim Traoré's legal team filed a defamation and dignity violation lawsuit against Adam Schiff. $90,000. Not for the money. For the message. The lawsuit quoted Article 4 of the Burkina Faso Constitution and a signed affidavit from the Burkina Faso Press Council, stating that the comment endangered the dignity and perception of its head of state abroad. One line from the filing stood out. "When mockery becomes policy, silence is no longer strength. It is surrender." The U.S. media called it overreaction. The African Union called it a masterstroke. And Schiff? He called his lawyers. Adam Schiff didn't take the lawsuit seriously at first. His initial statement, delivered to reporters outside Capitol Hill, was smug. "Let's not confuse free speech with fragile pride." He laughed. His aides laughed. The camera crews did not. But that night, the story wasn't about his press conference. It was about what came next. Traoré posted a single video. No caption. No production. Just him, standing on red earth in front of a rural school in Burkina Faso. To the world. "We are not children. We are not props. And we are not here for your amusement." That 30-second clip hit 10 million views in 24 hours. African influencers, Caribbean scholars, and even civil rights leaders in the U.S. started reposting it with one sentence. "He sued for us." Meanwhile, Schiff's team scrambled. The State Department received quiet calls from diplomats across Africa asking, "Is this how America treats leaders of sovereign nations?" CNN, trying to downplay the tension, re-uploaded the original clip with the title, "Unscripted Moment Sparks Global Debate." But the damage was done. In Ghana, a mural went up overnight, Traoré, painted in golds and reds, with the words, "Mocked, but not moved." In New York, Columbia students organized a forum called, "Who Gets to Laugh? Power, Race, and Dignity in Media." And in D.C., behind closed doors, Democratic aides begged Schiff to apologize. He refused. Apologize? For what? Hurting a dictator's feelings, he snapped. But the more he talked, the smaller he looked. Because Traoré didn't shout back. He didn't post memes or stage press conferences. He filed. Quietly. Legally. And in doing so, he flipped the script. 3 weeks later, the hearing date was confirmed. U.S. District Court, Washington, D.C. The media swarmed the courthouse. Most thought Traoré wouldn't show up. They were wrong. He arrived in silence. No motorcade. No grand announcement. Just a dark suit, brown shoes dusted from red soil, and a folder in hand, no entourage. Inside the courtroom, Adam Schiff sat with a legal team that looked more like a campaign war room than a defense table. As Traoré walked in, Schiff gave a slight smirk. Whispered to his lawyer, "We'll have this thrown out before lunch." The judge entered. The room stood. But before Schiff's team could launch into their motion to dismiss, Traoré's lawyer stepped forward with a single-page statement. "Your Honor, this is not about injury to ego. It is about the injury of perception, when a man elected by his people is laughed at on live television for not belonging." He paused, then handed over video compilations from African students, journalists, and activists responding to the incident. Not with threats, but with stories. Stories of being dismissed, mocked, minimized. The judge raised an eyebrow. Traoré stood calm. "Mr. Schiff thinks this is about pride. It's about precedent. You can disagree with me. You can challenge my policies. But you cannot call me illegitimate for being born in a place you don't understand." The gallery was silent. Schiff's smile faded. For the first time, this wasn't just about a viral clip. It was about every room Traoré had ever been in where his accent was a punchline. Every meeting where his country's name was met with a smirk. And now, in the heart of Washington, he was drawing the line. As the hearing continued, Adam Schiff leaned into his legal team, still whispering strategy, still smirking, as if the courtroom was a campaign stage. But then something shifted. Traoré's team called a witness. Not a politician. Not a diplomat. A young woman named Awa Kaboré. Awa was a 26-year-old journalist from Burkina Faso. Fluent in 3 languages. Harvard graduate. And the clip of Schiff's adorable comment? She was in the audience that night. She took the stand. When Mr. Schiff laughed, she began, "I didn't feel offended as a Burkinabe. I felt erased, as a human being." The courtroom fell quiet. Even Schiff turned to face her fully. "My country has 21 million people. We have poets, doctors, soldiers, and scientists. But because we don't have certain brands or buildings, you think we don't belong at the table." That laughter? It echoed louder than any insult. Then she held up her press badge. CNN. Tore it in half. And placed it on the railing. Gasps filled the courtroom. The judge banged the gavel, but the silence that followed was even louder. Even reporters from the Washington Post stood up to take notes. Outside, protesters began gathering, African flags, signs reading, "We're not your joke. Respect is not optional. Traoré stands. We rise." Schiff's legal team began to sweat. This wasn't the quiet dismissal they expected. This was a storm they had no script for. And through it all, Traoré sat motionless. He wasn't defending himself. He was defending something bigger. The right not to be ridiculed simply for existing outside their worldview. By the 5th day of proceedings, Adam Schiff's smirk had vanished. His legal team pivoted. Their new strategy? Paint Traoré as a thin-skinned authoritarian. Frame the lawsuit as a political stunt to suppress free speech. "Your Honor," Schiff's lead attorney said, "if public figures can't handle sarcasm, they shouldn't be on television." But Traoré's side didn't flinch. They responded with footage, not of the insult, but of its impact. Clips rolled from across the globe. A teacher in Nairobi explaining to students how mockery erodes dignity. A youth summit in Dakar canceling their CNN stream in solidarity. A Boston protest sign, "When they laugh at one of us, they laugh at all of us." Then came the turning point. Traoré's attorney held up a page from Schiff's own memoir, where he had once written, "Words can weaponize perception. And perception shapes policy." The courtroom froze. The attorney turned to Schiff. "Your own words acknowledge the power of rhetoric. So which is it, Congressman? Are words just jokes now, or policy shapers when convenient?" Schiff shifted uncomfortably. No answer. The judge leaned forward. "Mr. Schiff, do you dispute that your words affected international perception of a sitting head of state?" "I was being humorous," Schiff muttered. "Humor is protected speech." The judge replied, cool and direct. "So is dignity. And in this court, we protect both." A murmur spread through the gallery. Reporters began scribbling faster. What had started as a dismissed lawsuit had become something more. A referendum on power, tone, and who gets to define what counts as harmless. Outside, more crowds gathered. Not just in D.C., but in Ouagadougou, Lagos, Johannesburg, and even London. The message was clear. This wasn't just about Traoré. It was about every leader, every student, every citizen who'd ever been laughed out of a room they had earned their way into. With the pressure mounting, Schiff's advisors met in private. Donors were nervous. Polling was dipping. CNN was quietly reviewing the segment, and liberal news anchors were starting to ask, was this just arrogance dressed as cleverness? A formal apology could have cooled it all. Just one press conference. One sentence, "I misspoke, and I regret it." But Schiff refused. Apologizing to him would be feeding a dictator's ego, he snapped in a closed-door strategy session. "I won't do it." Word leaked. And Traoré? He still hadn't spoken to the media. No interviews. No drama. Just quiet appearances, universities, community centers, town halls across Africa, where he repeated one message. This isn't about feelings. It's about borders. Not lines drawn on maps, lines drawn in respect. Meanwhile, the hashtag #HeWantToSaySorry started trending across multiple countries. Even public figures outside politics began weighing in. Trevor Noah, that wasn't a joke. That was a punchline aimed at an entire continent. Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie, laughter at the expense of dignity is colonialism in a different accent. Cornel West, Traoré represents more than himself. That's what makes Schiff nervous. The final blow came from inside the U.S. State Department. An anonymous diplomat leaked an internal memo titled "Damage to U.S. Africa Relations," the Schiff episode. It warned that the lawsuit had galvanized a new wave of African self-respect movements, and that silence from Washington was no longer neutral. By the end of the week, 30 embassies across Africa had endorsed Traoré's lawsuit as a symbolic stand for modern dignity. Adam Schiff stood firm. But it didn't look like strength anymore. It looked like a man cornered by his own arrogance. And outside that courtroom in D.C., one phrase kept echoing louder. He doesn't have to shout. He has already won. The court recessed for 2 days. But outside, the momentum only grew. Universities across the U.S. held forums on media bias and international respect. One Georgetown panel titled "Mockery versus Diplomacy" ended with a standing ovation for a guest speaker from Burkina Faso. Even in European capitals, Paris, Berlin, Amsterdam, graffiti started appearing in alleyways and metros. Respect is not a punchline. Traoré wasn't amused, he was right. Meanwhile, Schiff remained publicly defiant. He doubled down on the talk show circuit. "This is an overreaction," he told MSNBC. "He's using our courts to make a political statement." But the irony was impossible to ignore. A U.S. congressman mocked a foreign leader on American TV. Now he was furious that the same American system was being used against him. And Traoré? He didn't give interviews. He didn't tweet. Instead, his legal team released one written statement. Freedom of speech is a right. But if dignity is trampled in the process, it is not freedom. It's theater. That quote was plastered across student unions from UCLA to Oxford. Schiff's PR team grew desperate. They pitched a counter-narrative, claiming Traoré's government had its own media problems, trying to shift the spotlight. But it backfired. People weren't comparing systems. They were comparing moments. Traoré hadn't tried to silence Schiff. He had engaged him, legally, calmly, and with precision. And now the world was watching a different kind of strength. The strength to answer laughter with law. The strength to let silence speak louder than anger. In a world addicted to outrage and soundbites, Traoré had become something rare. A man who didn't need to yell. Because history had already started quoting him. The day of the final hearing arrived. The courtroom was packed, journalists, activists, diplomats from 3 continents. Traoré entered quietly, again with no entourage. Schiff entered behind him, expression tight, lips drawn. But before the judge could speak, something unexpected happened. A letter was submitted by the African Union, co-signed by 42 member states. It didn't demand a verdict. It didn't threaten consequences. It simply said, the outcome of this case is not the legacy. The courage to bring it forward already is. The judge read it silently and nodded. Then he turned to the court. This hearing is no longer about financial damages. It's about whether words, public words, carry weight, even when disguised as wit. He paused. Mr. Schiff, you are protected by the First Amendment. But protection is not immunity from consequences, especially those that echo across borders. Then, turning to Traoré. You do not seek vengeance. You seek recognition. That, this court acknowledges. No fine was imposed. No jail time. No apology required by law. But what came next mattered more. The official court transcript included Traoré's closing sentence, entered into public record. If dignity must be defended in silence, then let this silence speak forever. That quote was instantly framed and mounted in the African Union headquarters. A version appeared days later on the wall of the United Nations press gallery. And Schiff? He walked out of that courtroom a free man, legally. But politically? He was branded. Not as a villain, perhaps. But as a reminder, even small laughs leave long shadows. By the time Adam Schiff returned to Capitol Hill, things had changed. A junior congressman from Illinois asked him, half-jokingly, if he'd be mocking any more foreign leaders this week. Schiff didn't respond. He'd expected the storm to pass. Instead, it had grown, not in anger, but in awakening. Because while Schiff faded from headlines, Traoré became something else. A symbol, not just of African dignity, but of strategic restraint. He returned to Burkina Faso to a crowd of thousands. Not cheering for revenge, but thanking him for respect. A new mural appeared in Ouagadougou. It showed Traoré sitting calmly, hands folded, with the words. He didn't yell. He didn't beg. He just filed. In the US, universities added the Traoré case to ethics courses. One Ivy League professor called it a masterclass in how to confront ridicule without stooping to it. Meanwhile, a poll conducted by Pew Research revealed a surprising shift. For the first time in years, favorable views of African leadership among young Americans had risen, driven, in part, by the case. International commentators drew comparisons. Martin Luther King Jr., strength through civility. Mandela, revolution without rage. Traoré, sovereignty through silence. Even late-night hosts who had initially mocked the lawsuit began retracting their jokes. Turns out, one said, Traoré had more class in a courtroom than most politicians have in a campaign. Schiff? He published a short op-ed in The Atlantic titled, "Freedom of Speech Must Be Humble, Too." But it was too late. Because Traoré hadn't just changed a conversation. He'd raised the cost of careless speech. 6 months later, no one was talking about the $90,000. They were talking about the silence that followed it. Traoré never cashed a settlement. In fact, after the court closed the case, he sent a public letter to Schiff, not for reconciliation, but for clarity. "I didn't want your apology. I wanted your understanding. If that never comes, I'll settle for your pause." That line alone became a quote printed on shirts, posters, and even classroom walls across universities in Africa and Europe. In Burkina Faso, a public service campaign launched under the banner, "We don't clap back, we stand up." It wasn't about revenge. It was about setting the tone for a generation tired of being spoken about, not to. Meanwhile, Traoré's approval rating soared, not for his domestic policies, but for something rarer in politics. Control. Dignity. Precision. At a UN forum later that year, he walked into a room that once barely noticed him. This time, the murmurs fell silent, not out of fear, but respect. He took the podium and said only this. "They mocked what they didn't understand. Then we showed them they couldn't silence it. We didn't shout back. We just stood still, until their noise fell beneath our stillness." The room erupted. Even those who didn't like him nodded. Because in a world where political battles are usually won with rage, volume, and spectacle, Traoré had done something different. He turned a mockery into a moment. He turned a courtroom into a compass. And with $90,000 worth of silence, he redrew the map of who gets the last word.